Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, can certainly be considered one of the most anticipated video game experiences of the year 2024. After the incredible success of the base game, Shadow of the Erdtree did something that seemed impossible. It brought even more players into the community. As someone who has been playing these kinds of games since Dark Souls, it makes me incredibly happy to see the sheer success that FromSoft has obtained with its formula and philosophies. As for the game itself, it took me about 45 hours to beat Shadow of the Erdtree. Due to my employment and family obligations, these hours were spread out over the span of about 3 weeks. At the end of my playthrough, I shared my thoughts in their raw form, but I wanted to give myself some time to digest everything that Shadow of the Erdtree had to offer. I believe that enough time has passed. My dear viewer, I can firmly and confidently say that Elden Ring's DLC is the best video game experience that we can find in the contemporary market. It provides value, it is fun, and it does a good job at welcoming new players to the Souls. Overall, it is a good game, and unfortunately, it is harder to find these nowadays. Be that as it may, it would be foolish to say that Shadow of the Erdtree is perfect or beyond criticism. There are things that I did not like, and things that I believe could have been done better. Thus, we have reached the meat of this stew. What did Shadow of the Erdtree do right? And most importantly, what did it do wrong? Let's get started. Singing Shadow of the Erdtree's praises is potentially the easiest thing to do in the world. The game does almost everything right, and this shows in the results that it has obtained, both in terms of numbers and community. Elden Ring has obtained a status of supremacy among players due to achieving great balance between two very important things: discovery and combat. Shadow of the Erdtree maintains this status and supremacy because it does something that many other games fail to do or even understand. It sticks to its strengths. Shadow of the Erdtree does not present a huge change from the base Elden Ring. It does not change the formula, and it does not try to be anything that isn't just more Elden Ring. More discovery, more combat. This may sound ridiculously obvious, but Shadow of the Erdtree does something that is key to success. It gives players what they want. In the current status quo of video games actively trying to tell players what they want, FromSoft did what others refuse. They listened. After seeing the success of Elden Ring, FromSoft developers sat down at a table, looked at each other and said, "We should make more." And more they made. Starting the DLC is relatively simple. You walk to Needle Knight Leda over at Mog's Palace and then grab Mikla's decrepit hand to be teleported into the Land of Shadow. I would have preferred for the teleport to be a coffin that you jump into, but we get one of those anyways over at the Shadow Keep, so it's not a big deal. After the transition, you appear at a small cave, and upon exiting the cave, you are met with a field completely populated with spirit gravestones. From here, it is up to you. You can go north or you can go south. Much like Elden Ring before it, Shadow of the Erdtree gives the player so much agency and freedom that it is overwhelming at first. That said, as the player covers ground and begins to get map fragments and sites of grace, a satisfying feeling creeps through your fingers and into your brain. This is discovery, and it makes the Land of Shadow a magnificent place to explore. We have the blues of the Cerulean coast, the red of Kara's hidden grave, the constant lightning strikes of the jagged peak, and the darkness of the abyssal woods. There are many different environments spread about the Land of Shadow that express different feelings and keep the player in constant awe. Whether it's on foot or riding torrent, we are treated to many different visual splendors that instilled in me a constant need to keep going. Personally speaking, I never got bored of looking around and searching for the next possible new piece of equipment. There were also a few key locations like the different jails filled with pot warriors or the shaman village, Marika's home, that were capable of telling full stories with their mere existence. Exploring and discovering the Land of Shadow was a treat and definitely one of the highlights of my own experience. I personally loved every moment of it. Exploring the whole map also helped me understand the sheer size and complexity of the Land of Shadow. FromSoft outdid themselves by making the Land of Shadow the epitome of Elden Ring's spatial philosophy. The whole overworld was built as if it were one gigantic legacy dungeon with a focus on verticality. Before the DLC was released, Miyazaki said in an interview that he estimated the size of the Land of Shadow to be about the same size as Limgrave was in the base game. In true Miyazaki nature, he grossly underestimated the scope of his own game. The Land of Shadow is not the size of Limgrave, it is the size of 3 Limgraves stacked one on top of each other, providing a sense of scale that goes far beyond what we can initially see in the map fragments that we pick up while exploring. There are areas connected to each other via underground tunnels or rivers. There are full and complete sections of the game accessible only by jumping into a hole in the ground or performing the right gesture at the right place. And of course, there are mountains and towers to scale, letting us reach the highest point of the Land of Shadow. It is an incredibly clever way of designing Shadow of the Erdtree's map in a way that increases its total size while maintaining its surface area controlled. I am sure that you, my dear viewer, much like I did, were constantly asking yourself 2 questions. How do I get down there? And how do I get up there? Altogether, the Land of Shadow was set up to give players ample space to play and experiment with new items and enemies, as well as different environments to experience, each telling a story of their own. And still, with all of this said, there are things that need to be addressed. We cannot ignore 2 very specific characteristics that caught my attention in a much more negative manner. First, the world seems to be empty. And second, the map was not as helpful as I would have hoped. Believe it or not, as much as I loved exploring the Land of Shadow, I can also say that it felt empty at times. Sure, it was not a constant feeling, but there were a few areas of the DLC that were quite barren and devoid of content. While exploring, it would be common for me to take the side passages and routes offered by the environment, climbing up rocks or jumping down cliffs that led to an item that is nothing more than a crafting material. In my opinion, I also believe that FromSoft abused the cookbook mechanic when it came to rewarding discovery. How many times did you go through an obscure side passage, find a purple item to pick up, and it was a cookbook with one single recipe? This would happen often, and after some hours, it began to leave a sour taste in my mouth. I must say that the exploration of the Land of Shadow could have benefited from a more varied item pickup and from cookbooks having more than one recipe in them. This is something that would also happen a lot with smithing stones. A lot of overworld pickups were simple upgrade materials that provided no value to me, as I had hundreds upon hundreds of them stashed away in my box. I can always buy upgrade materials over at the Round Table Hall. Give me more meaningful items to reward my curiosity. In contrast, I thought that the amount of enemies in the world and their placement was correct. I never felt that I had nothing to fight. Some areas had a lot of enemies, while others had little. There is a variety in encounter sizes and difficulties, and most importantly, their placements made sense. There were enemies where there should be. There were not enemies where there shouldn't be. And the kinds of enemies in each area were appropriate lore-wise. The feeling of emptiness that I would get from some parts of the Land of Shadow is definitely attributed to a lack of appropriate pickups that reward exploration with something that can be considered worth the time and hassle invested in reaching certain places. More than once during my playthrough, I found a location that I wanted to reach, formulated a strategy to get to it, traversed the environment, and, upon reaching my objective, I picked up a smithing stone 6, being left with a feeling of, is this really it? I will admit that this is not a big issue for me. I got a lot out of my exploration thanks to the environment and the lore each place provides. But this cannot be ignored. There are players that require more tangible results to the time that they invest exploring. In this regard, I did find Shadow of the Erdtree lacking. Now, as for my second point, I do have a much heavier implication in this one. I was heavily disappointed with how the map worked in Shadow of the Erdtree. Contrary to the base game, where the map was a huge source of information and strategy, the map in Shadow of the Erdtree served to confuse the player more than help it. While in the base game we had map fragments for underground areas and concise imagery of area transitions, Shadow of the Erdtree's map does very little to physically show players the different tunnels, underground rivers, and some full segments of the Land of Shadow. Let's be honest, we go through the Stone Coughing Fissure, a full dungeon-like cavern that leads to Saint Trina's Garden of Deep Purple, and we don't get a map for it. It all looks like random sites of grace on top of the water. Traversing this area and understanding it would have been much more enjoyable with its own section of the map. The lack of this visual aid was surprising and confusing, seeing as how FromSoft already treated underground areas like Siofra River and the Deep Root Depths to their own specific and detailed map fragments. Exploration and discovery in base Elden Ring was incredible, and part of its success was how accurate and reliable the map was. In my opinion, Shadow of the Erdtree's map of the Land of Shadow loses some of its reliability and makes it a bit more frustrating to wander through the DLC. When the Land of Shadow is made up of multiple levels superimposed on top of each other, when the verticality of legacy dungeons is brought over into the general overworld, you need an accurate map to help the player understand the layout of the environment that they are exploring. This is something that affected me greatly. There were many moments in which the map was more of a hindrance rather than help, and this led to a lot of personal confusion. In this case, this is something that I give a lot of importance to, and I must say that I was heavily disappointed, especially since this was something that was done so well in the base game. When it comes to equipment, Shadow of the Erdtree performed outstandingly. I loved everything that was done in the DLC when it comes to armaments, armor, spells, and talismans. Of course, each player will have their reservations as to specific additions that may have been missed, but overall, almost every weapon class, if not all of them, got something new to play with. On top of this, there were new weapon type additions that generated new playstyles, or, at the very least, provided new gimmicks to explore. Not only this, but a good number of new talismans and some new spells give players new interactions to explore and theorize with. I was particularly impressed with a few weapons that provide additional value on top of their inherent stats. For example, the Black Steel Great Hammer, possibly my favorite new addition to the Elden Ring arsenal, generates an additional AoE damage effect after doing a guard counter. Another example is the Blood Fiend's Arm, which releases an explosion of blood flame after every fully charged R2. This explosion deals additional fire damage and causes bleed buildup. As you can see, these additional effects provide more advantages while defining each weapon within a playstyle. The Black Steel Great Hammer will be better with a shield to take advantage of guard counters, and the Blood Fiend's Arm is definitely geared to be two-handed, focusing on those charged attacks. The addition of thrown weapons through the Smith's Grip series and a few other key armaments also add a new layer of strategy that the player can take advantage of. Having access to both melee attacks and a ranged option within the same weapon creates quality of life for tarnished like me who like to be prepared for everything. The new perfume armaments, the new hand-to-hand martial arts movesets, weapons with benefits when used with a specific infusions, I could dedicate a full video to the new weapon variety. The point is that all of these new weapons, talismans, and spells that we got make the experience richer for the player and increase the value of the game. We can sit down and talk about whether each addition is powerful or weak, but when it comes to the principle of trying new concepts, I think that FromSoft did a lot of good here. I do want to take a few seconds to mention the new armor sets that were added. I have to say, we got some prime fashion improvements. Particularly, there are a few sets of heavier knight type armor that I love. I am incredibly happy with the new possibilities. My dear viewer, in all seriousness, I have no complaints. The DLC had outstanding equipment additions. When it comes to the combat in Shadow of the Erdtree, there's really not much to say, and that is a good thing. The DLC shares the same combat as the base game. There are very little changes, if any at all, which results in the players getting more of the same combat that we enjoyed in Elden Ring. Like we mentioned in the beginning of this video, more is good. We continue to have the dodge, block, and parry trifecta that has existed since Demon's Souls. We continue to have Elden Ring's additions of Spirit Summons and Stance Breaks. Poise is there, damage negation is there, jump attacks are there. Everything is there and it continues to blend together perfectly into a system that is coherent, sustainable, and most importantly, fun. Taking into consideration the direction that FromSoft is going with the difficulty in their games, having this many options is not only recommended, but also necessary. Personally, I am very satisfied with Elden Ring's combat, and I believe that it is a part of the game that has reached its zenith. I honestly do not know what more FromSoft could do to make the combat better. Maybe just go ahead and add the Sekiro deflect system? Sure, we got the new physics tier, but honestly 5 minutes is not enough for the fun time that it provides. Moving on to bosses, in my opinion, the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree follow a very balanced scope. Some are very good, some are very bad, and there is a group that remains in the center position of irrelevance that, quite honestly, has disappointed me. Statistically speaking, there are approximately 42 unique bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. I say approximately because depending on how each player decides to count, we could have a few more or a few less. Furthermore, if we were to count every single furnace golem, ulcerated tree spirit, and dragon, we could probably get about 80 bosses. Personally speaking, I think that counting each specific instance of each specific boss is a bit disingenuous. For this reason, I counted one instance of every boss in the DLC and I got 42. Again, it could be 40 or it could be 45 depending on how many dragons and tree sentinels you decide to count, but nevertheless, the approximation is safe. Regardless, the point I'm trying to make is that most of these bosses have a sense of irrelevancy. They are not bad and they fit within the lore of the locations that they appear. The bosses, they make sense, but they provide nothing special. If we are to focus on the truly important bosses, the Remembrance bosses, then we have a total of 11 new fights in Shadow of the Erdtree. In order to formulate my point, we will use these as examples. The 11 Remembrance bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree are, in alphabetical order, Baal, Dancing Dragon, Gaius, Mesmer, Meteor, Mother of Fingers, Midra, Promised Consort Radon, Putrescent Knight, Relana, Romina, and Shadow Sunflower. Out of this list, my solidified top 3 is Relana as the undisputed best boss fight in the DLC. Then, in second place is Vale, and finally, it is Mesmer who occupies the third place. Although, I will accept Promised Consort Radon here as well. It's a matter of perspective. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I only disliked one fight, Gaius. I cannot stand this boss fight, and I believe that the game would be better without it. Furthermore, I will also say that Midra deserves an honorable mention as a boss fight, but otherwise, I honestly don't care much about the rest. Dancing Lion, Mother of Fingers, Putrescent Knight, Romina, and Shadow Sunflower. Half of the Remembrance bosses left me completely apathetic. I do not think that this is good, taking into consideration the importance of boss fights within the style of game that FromSoft produces. These fights are the cornerstone of the genre that the Souls games have defined, and having unforgettable bosses is extremely important. No one will ever forget Ornstein and Smog for their significance. No one will ever forget Capra Demon for its shock value, and no one will ever forget Bed of Chaos due to its dog shit design. In the same way, Nameless King defined the philosophy of every Elden Ring boss that was to come, and of course, every single player has etched into their brain the absolute aura that Ludwig provided by combining a perfectly choreographed boss with probably some of the best soundtrack that FromSoft decided to create. All of these fights are memorable and defined the game that they were in one way or another. In contrast, Shadow of the Erdtree had great opportunities to make some boss fights unforgettable, but it was not able to capitalize on them. The biggest example here is Meteor, Mother of Fingers. This boss is potentially the biggest lore drop of the DLC, revealing the origin and characteristics of the two fingers, communicators of the greater will, and there is no cutscene for it. There is also no dialogue. I understand that as a creature it probably cannot speak, but we have examples of the finger readers interpreting their movements. It would have been interesting to have more interactions of this kind. Instead, we are teleported to the boss arena that immediately activates when we get closer to the boss. This boss fight gets a full quest that develops its mysteries, and the conclusion is honestly very unfortunate. It struck me as a huge missed opportunity. Now, it is not all bad. Relana, as I mentioned before, is an instant classic of a boss. The fight is amazing with incredible flow and pacing. Relana is very well balanced in her abilities, and the lore and repercussions of your duel with her have a lot of weight in the overarching story of the Land of Shadows. Then, of course, we have Baal, a completely optional boss fight that has some of the most iconic NPC interactions in the whole Soul series. As a boss fight, Baal is absolutely fantastic, but it is perfected thanks to his synergy with Egon. The very first time that I defeated Vale, I fought him without summons, without Egon. Afterwards, I returned to fight him again, and this time I summoned Egon. Let me tell you, the experience was incredibly magnified by his presence. Vale and Egon are a perfect example of a fulfilled opportunity. In this case, FromSoft saw the chance to create greatness and they took it. No one will ever forget their first time defeating Vale, and no one will ever forget the first time they hear the cry of the truest Drake warrior that has ever existed. In the end, my dear viewer, I am satisfied with the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. There were some very good ones. There is only one bad one, but there's also a lot of them, a good bit of them, that I did not care for. Hell, some of them I do not even remember their names. I think that the experience was good, but I also believe that it could have been better if FromSoft could have taken advantage of a few more opportunities. To conclude, there is more good than bad when it comes to bosses, but in some cases, I honestly cannot help but wonder what could have been. To finish my exposition, I want to briefly go over a few topics that are much more complicated in their scope and as such deserve their own videos. For these topics, I will give you my bottom line opinion, but I will not provide details. The reason is simple. If I were to go through my full motivation for these opinions, the present video will probably be about 45 minutes longer, and I believe that this would not be a good service to this video and to those topics. The three topics that I will be covering in their own separate videos are the difficulty of Shadow of the Erdtree, the promised Consort Radahn fight, and the general direction and philosophy of contemporary Soul bosses. To summarize, first, I really do not think that Shadow of the Erdtree was hard at all. Second, I did not like the final boss, promised Consort Radahn. And third, I am increasingly worried about the direction the boss fights have been going with each iteration of the Souls games. As for the reasons why I believe this, as mentioned before, each topic deserves its own video, and I will try my best to represent my ideas in the most honest and fair way possible. This requires time, and each video will get the amount that is necessary. Please do look forward to these. As I have said in the beginning of this video, I believe that Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, is the absolute best video game experience that we can get in the present video game environment. An expansion that offers at least 30 hours of content that can be stretched out to a total of 45 hours with the same or higher quality that was shown in base Elden Ring at the price point of $40. is completely unheard of. It is a unicorn, and this is without taking into consideration the sheer replay value that we can get from it through different builds and challenges. It is not a perfect experience because nothing is, but I can say with absolute certainty that you will not find anything like it. Not only is it worth every single dollar of its cost, but also every second that you put into it. Shadow of the Erdtree, much like its base game Elden, is a game that gets better the more you learn about it. Every single hour you spend playing this game will be rewarded in one way or another. In the same way, I also expressed a few key notes that disappointed me. There were some missed opportunities that could have elevated the game to unprecedented status. But after all is said and done, I am extremely satisfied and happy with the product. This, my dear viewer, is a good game, and we should hold all other games to this standard in order to improve the video game landscape. If we settle for a subpar product, we will continue getting subpar products. As players, we want good games. And this, my dear viewer, is not only good, it is the goddamn best. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I get to see you on the next one.